Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the dark truths of medieval marriages. Unions forged not for love, but for duty, property, and the survival of families and kingdoms. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. I have walked through halls where banners of proud families hung heavy in the air, and I have seen how marriage was less a bond of affection than a chain of duty. In those times, a union bound not merely two souls, but two lineages, forging ties between houses that might otherwise stand as rivals. Wealth and power moved more surely through these vows than through armies. Love, if it came at all, was an afterthought whispered behind stone walls. Among the nobles, every agreement bore the weight of parchment and seal. Fathers and uncles spoke louder than brides and grooms, for it was they who calculated the worth of land and dowry. Each handshake at the council table was a promise that carried armies, fields, and villages within it. The betrothed themselves were often but pawns, their futures arranged before they could even speak their own will. I remember the silence in their eyes, the heavy resignation learned too young. For the church, marriage served as a tool to tame a world fractured by conflict and ambition. Priests praised it as a holy bond, yet its holiness was measured by the peace it brought to lords and the obedience it secured among the common folk. In every village, from the cobbled streets of France to the thatched huts of England, marriage was less a dream than a commandment. Survival was bound tightly to the rituals, and few dared to resist. The peasants too bore the burden of this order, though their stakes were humbler. A small flock of sheep, a cow, or a patch of fertile soil could seal the future of two families. To wed was to endure, to assure that no field lay fallow and no hearth grew cold. In their eyes, the ceremony held not grandeur, but necessity, a weary step into a life already charted by hunger and labor. Even kings and queens bent their hearts to this law of alliances. What mattered most was not affection, but inheritance, not desire, but legacy. The love of a monarch, if it strayed, often hid in shadows, while the marriage stood firm in daylight, binding kingdoms together with invisible iron. I have seen thrones upheld or shattered by the strength of such contracts, for no king stood alone without the alliances his wife's dowry secured. It is tempting to believe that some found happiness despite these chains, and indeed, a few did. Yet most lived within a cage built of expectation, where the weight of family honor pressed upon every choice. The vows spoken at the altar carried the weight of centuries, linking past and future with little space for the present moment. Each smile, each embrace, was often practiced for the watching crowd. To those of us who lived in that age, marriage felt like a great ledger of debts and duties. Sons were weighed against daughters, and unions became entries in a book none of us could close. The common man might have sought warmth in his bride's hands, but even there the echo of family demands was never far away. No union was free from the gaze of parents, lords, or priests. When I think back, the truth stands bare. Marriage in my age was less a matter of hearts entwined and more a contract etched in necessity. We did not wed for the flutter of affection, but for the solidity of land, the promise of heirs, and the balance of power. Such was the way of survival. And though the fire warms my face tonight, the memory of those cold bindings still lingers in my soul. In the quiet hush of stone cathedrals, where candles flickered against the chill of morning, the church took hold of marriage as if it were a crown to be guarded. By the 12th century, its voice rose above kings and nobles, declaring the bond not merely human, but divine. To wed became to step into a sacrament, indissoluble and binding beyond death. Priests stood as gatekeepers, their blessing the only passage into legitimacy. What had once been a family's private pact now belonged to the altar. The shift was immense, and I witnessed its weight across Europe. Villagers who once pledged vows beneath the open sky found themselves drawn to church doors, where holy water and Latin prayers replaced the simplicity of ancestral rites. A union without priestly sanction was cast into shadow, its children branded illegitimate. Fear of such judgment was strong, for legitimacy meant inheritance, and inheritance was life itself. Papal decrees fell like iron across the land, spelling out who could marry and who could not. Cousins and kin were forbidden unless dispensation was bought with coin or favour. Annulments became matters of law, handled in ecclesiastical courts where robed judges spoke the will of Rome. For many, these courts were the final arbiters, deciding whether a marriage was sacred or sinful, binding or broken. I recall disputes that dragged on for years, with families pleading their cases before bishops who balanced scripture against politics. A union annulled might unravel alliances carefully woven, yet the church rarely yielded once it had declared its judgment. Its hold was firm, reminding all that salvation itself was thought to pass through these gates. Marriage, once a practical tie, had become a holy burden. Yet there was comfort, too, for those who believed. The church gave sanctity to what had often been stark necessity, wrapping it in ritual and promise of divine witness. To many, this offered solace in a harsh and uncertain world, where famine and war lurked at the edge of each season. The sacrament transformed daily survival into something eternal, even if the heart was not always consulted. Still, this holiness came with constraint. The rules narrowed choices, binding men and women into paths already drawn by canon law. Families that once might have arranged matches freely now bent under the authority of clerics. I saw fathers grumble in silence when bishops forbade unions that would have secured them land or allies. The church's voice was not easily resisted. Its hand extended into every corner of life. Priests recorded names, unions, and children, weaving a vast ledger of souls that outlasted battles and kings. Through marriage, the church strengthened its roots, anchoring itself in the very heart of society. To live outside its rules was to risk exile, not only from community, but from salvation itself. Thus did the holy institution of marriage become a double-edged sword. It sanctified the union of man and woman, lifting it beyond the soil into the realm of heaven. Yet it also shackled choice, curbing freedom in favor of order. I have walked both roads, the quiet blessing that comforted the weary, and the stern decree that crushed the hopeful. Both bore the seal of the church, unyielding in its grasp. In the gilded courts of Europe, I learned quickly that affection rarely guided the joining of noble houses. Children were promised away long before they reached maturity, their futures exchanged like coin across tables heavy with scrolls and seals. To be born into nobility was to become a piece in a game larger than oneself, where treaties and bloodlines outweighed the beating of one's heart. Betrothals were set in motion years in advance, their outcome rarely questioned. I remember how young brides and grooms sometimes met for the first time, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the church where vows were spoken. Their eyes revealed the strangeness of strangers bound for life, yet no hesitation was permitted. Around them, courtiers and clerics whispered, measuring every gesture for signs of loyalty and strength. A marriage was a performance as much as a contract, and the stage was the kingdom itself. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose unions shifted the fate of Christendom. Her marriages, first to Louis VII of France and then to Henry II of England, reshaped maps and drew nations into rivalry. Personal desire held little place in her path, for her womb was considered as valuable as her lands. So it was with countless others, though Eleanor's story echoes louder through the centuries. I saw how these unions were celebrated not for love, but for what they secured. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, by their bond, forged a Spain united under one crown. Their match was heralded as divine providence, yet its roots lay in strategy as much as faith. One could scarcely separate altar from throne or prayer from politics. The family dinner table was no less a battlefield than the field of war. Among lesser nobles, the pattern was much the same. Sons were bartered for alliances, daughters weighed for dowries and lands. The choice was never theirs to make, and few resisted openly. Resistance risked dishonor, and dishonor could mean ruin for an entire lineage. Silence, obedience, and acceptance became virtues expected of the young. What strikes me most is how youth itself was consumed by these designs. Boys were bound before they understood war, and girls before they knew womanhood. Entire lives unfolded as extensions of ancestral ambitions. The laughter of childhood was often overshadowed by the solemnity of contracts that promised futures neither party could yet grasp. It was as if destiny itself were written by the hands of others. Such marriages could indeed bring peace, binding kingdoms together in fragile harmony. But they could also plant seeds of future conflict when claims of inheritance overlapped or alliances soured. Wars were born from wedding feasts as often as they were ended by them. History itself is marked with the tremors of such unions, echoes of promises made in gilded halls and broken in blood. In those courts, marriage was the grandest stage of politics. Behind the silks and processions, it was a matter of survival for dynasties, the weaving of threads that tied continents together. And though smiles were painted on young faces, I saw the weariness in their eyes, the quiet knowledge that their lives were never truly their own. Such was the noble fate, to carry the weight of a marriage that belonged more to kingdom than to heart. I recall how every marriage among both noble and common folk bore the mark of wealth transferred, for no union was complete without the negotiation of a dowry. It was more than a gift, it was the lifeblood of the agreement, ensuring that the bride did not enter her new household empty-handed. Gold, land, livestock, even fine cloth might pass from father to husband. Behind each exchange lay years of savings, toil, and sacrifice. The dowry was the silent weight pressing upon every family's shoulders. Among the powerful, dowries became instruments of strategy. Estates expanded, castles reinforced, and armies equipped through the wealth that came with a bride. A single daughter could elevate a house to prominence, or drag it into ruin, depending on what her family could provide. I watched men of ambition bargain as fiercely over these contributions as they did on the battlefield. Their calculations cared little for the girl herself. Her worth was measured in coin and land. For the peasants, the burden was no lighter, though the sums were humbler. A cow, a few acres, or a chest of household goods could mean the difference between acceptance or rejection. Families would sometimes work for years to assemble a suitable dowry, denying themselves comfort in the present to secure a daughter's uncertain future. The weight of expectation fell hardest on the poor, whose daughters carried hopes that exceeded their means. The dowry did not vanish after the wedding feast. It followed the bride as both protection and tether, a part of her identity in her husband's home. If misfortune struck and the husband died, she might reclaim part of it to sustain her widowhood. Yet this safeguard was often contested, as relatives sought to keep the wealth within their grasp. I have seen widows pleading for what was rightfully theirs, caught in the labyrinth of custom and law. This system also revealed the cruel imbalance of power between men and women. While the dowry granted a measure of security, it also confirmed the bride's role as a vessel for transferring wealth. She was less a partner than a passage through which fortunes flowed. Her name might be honored in the records, but it was the possessions she carried that secured her place. The woman herself was rarely regarded apart from her dowry. Even among the nobility, disputes over dowries could ignite feuds that outlasted the marriages they supported. Brothers quarreled, cousins drew swords, and entire clans split over unpaid promises. The wedding, meant to seal peace, often sowed discord through broken arrangements. Behind the smiles of processions lay the sharp reality of unpaid debts and unkept bargains. The dowry was as dangerous as it was essential. Some saw in the dowry a form of insurance, a safeguard for the vulnerable. But more often, it was a chain that bound women to the economic ambitions of their fathers and husbands. Even freedom was purchased at a price, and that price was rarely their own to decide. Such was the paradox. What was meant as protection too often became confinement. When I think of the dowry, I do not recall treasures glittering in the halls of kings. I remember instead the weary hands of peasants, the anxious whispers of fathers, and the heavy silence of daughters. Behind every chest of gold or basket of grain lay lives shaped by obligation. And though the custom was wrapped in ceremony and blessing, it bore the bitter taste of sacrifice unending. In some lands I wandered, the balance of wealth moved in the opposite direction, from groom to bride. The giving of a bride price was an ancient practice, rooted in Germanic and tribal customs, where a man demonstrated his commitment by offering wealth to his future wife and her family. This payment was not seen as purchase, though it carried that shadow, but rather as a recognition of her value. It bound him to his promise and marked the seriousness of his intent. The morgengabe, or morning gift, held its own quiet symbolism. After the wedding night, a husband was expected to present his wife with land, jewels, or other valuables. It was hers alone, untouched by his kin, meant to ensure her security should fate turn cruel. I have heard of women who clung to this gift like a lifeline, their only true possession in households otherwise controlled by men. In its best form, it offered dignity amid dependency. Such customs spoke of older ways. When marriage was not yet wholly under the rule of the church, they revealed traces of a time when families and tribes governed themselves long before papal decrees shaped every bond. In villages across Germany and Scandinavia, these practices lingered well into the Middle Ages. The church tolerated them at first, but slowly pressed them aside, replacing them with the dowry system it more firmly controlled. Yet traditions rarely vanish quickly. I recall disputes in which both dowry and morgengabe were demanded, burdening families and stretching them thin. In such cases, marriage became an exhausting exchange of wealth, leaving little room for affection or joy. The bride was caught between two worlds, her worth measured twice, by the goods she brought and the gift she received. Her happiness remained a distant consideration. Among the nobility, the morning gift sometimes took on grand proportions. Castles, estates, or towns were given in the name of love, though all knew it was duty. These grants strengthened dynastic ties, expanding a wife's influence while also tying her fate even closer to her husband's ambitions. To be given such power was both blessing and burden, for with property came expectation and peril. For peasants, the practice was humbler, yet no less important. A small field, a cow, or a set of tools might constitute the morning gift, simple tokens that meant survival. I once heard a widow recall that her morgengabe, a single acre of land, was all that stood between her children and starvation. In her voice was gratitude, but also sorrow, for even generosity carried the shadow of necessity. These customs revealed how deeply marriage intertwined with economics at every level of society. Whether through dowry or bride price, wealth was always at the heart of the bond. Even gestures dressed as gifts were bound to survival and power. Love may have flickered quietly within some homes, but the first language of marriage was always measured in coin, land, and promise. Looking back, the morgengabe stands out as a fragile echo of respect, a faint recognition of the woman's own standing in the union. It was never enough to grant her freedom, but it could grant her dignity, however small. And though time and the church diminished its presence, its memory lingers still, like a faint flame on the margins of medieval life, whispering of a different balance that might have been. I have seen vows spoken by lips far too young to understand their weight. In the eyes of the church, a girl of 12 and a boy of 14 were deemed old enough to marry, though the life awaiting them was one they could scarcely imagine. For nobles, The arrangement of such early unions served the needs of dynasties, not the innocence of childhood. A betrothal secured the future, locking alliances before rivals could intervene. The children themselves had little say, their lives charted before they grasped the meaning of choice. Often, these matches were formalities in their first years, their consummation delayed until the bride reached puberty. Yet many records show young girls moved into their husband's household long before that time, expected to adapt to a new family and new duties. The practice stripped them of youth, pressing upon them burdens of obedience and expectation. I recall seeing girls scarcely taller than the altar candles, already dressed in bridal finery, their faces pale with fear. The nobility considered such unions necessary. Kings and lords sought to strengthen their lines with bonds made early, ensuring heirs and stability for the generations to come. The sooner an alliance was forged, the sooner it could be defended. Families rivaled one another in their haste to secure suitable matches, and in the process, childhood became a currency spent too quickly. It was a practice that weighed heavily upon the smallest shoulders. Even among peasants, though less frequent, early marriages were not unknown. Poverty sometimes urged families to send their daughters away at tender ages, to lighten the household burden, or to secure survival through another family's land. While not bound by treaties and crowns, these unions were shaped by hunger and hardship. A girl might leave her home while still learning her prayers, her fate sealed by necessity rather than desire. The Church, while setting the ages of consent, claimed that love and patience should guide the consummation of such unions. Yet the reality was harsher. Custom often overshadowed doctrine, and the needs of family or estate rushed the process forward. What was meant to be delayed until maturity frequently came far too soon. In these moments, ideals of sacrament bowed to the weight of practice. The consequences of such early marriages were profound. Childbirth at a young age often endangered both mother and infant, with mortality haunting the halls of both castles and cottages. Many a young bride did not live to see her children grow. Those who survived bore the marks of their youth surrendered, stepping into adulthood before their bodies or minds had time to grow into it. Their resilience was remarkable, yet their losses undeniable. For boys, too, the burden was heavy, though in different form. At 14, a young groom might still be more squire than lord, tasked suddenly with responsibilities of estate and lineage. In his eyes lingered the confusion of one forced into manhood too early. Childhood games gave way to the weight of land, vassals, and duty, all borne on unsteady shoulders. Their struggle was quieter, but no less real. When I remember those unions, I see not royal splendor, nor peasant festivity, but the quiet sorrow of youth stolen. The sound of laughter replaced by oaths, the joy of play replaced by the heaviness of lineage. Such was the custom of our age, to bind children as if they were already seasoned in the trials of life. And though the stars burn as brightly now as they did then, they bear witness still to the lives shortened and reshaped by vows spoken too soon. In palaces, where every step echoed with ambition, marriage was rarely about companionship. For monarchs, it was the foundation upon which entire kingdoms rested. A union between two crowns was not measured in smiles, but in heirs, and in those heirs, the future stability of the realm. The fate of armies, thrones, and peoples depended upon whether a queen could bring forth children, and above all, sons. This relentless pressure weighed heavily on every royal marriage I witnessed. Queens were often judged not by their wisdom or their piety, but by the strength of their wombs. Catherine of Aragon comes often to mind. For her inability to bear a surviving male heir set into motion one of the greatest schisms in Christendom. Her devotion was unquestioned, her dignity remarkable, yet her worth in the eyes of court and king was bound almost entirely to succession. It was a cruel fate shared by countless women of her station. Dynastic disputes spilled into war when succession faltered. In England, The Wars of the Roses grew from tangled bloodlines and competing claims, many of them traced through marriages meant to secure peace. Each union promised to end strife, yet often planted seeds of further conflict. Cousins and rivals rose to arms, each proclaiming the legitimacy of their birth through contracts signed decades before. The battlefield became the final arbiter of whose marriage had truly prevailed. Beyond the bloodshed, there was the constant anxiety of continuity. Kings who failed to produce heirs feared rebellion, and those who produced too many risked division. I saw how brothers became enemies, and sisters pawns in treaties that promised stability, but delivered uncertainty. Every cradle in a royal nursery carried the weight of nations, and every lullaby echoed with political consequence. For noble houses beneath the crown, the pattern was much the same. Their loyalty often hinged upon the security of succession, for a childless king left every vassal uncertain of tomorrow. Marriages were arranged with meticulous care to avoid such peril, weaving bloodlines together in the hope of continuity. Still, history shows how often these hopes were disappointed, undone by illness, infertility, or untimely death. The Church lent its voice to these unions, declaring them holy and indissoluble, yet even its authority bent under the strain of succession. Annulments, though rare, were sought desperately when queens failed to provide heirs. Popes and bishops were drawn into the quarrels of kings, their judgments shaping not only families, but the direction of empires. Holy law met worldly necessity, and often the latter prevailed. The burden of this system fell most harshly upon the women. A queen might be loved by her people, wise in counsel, and devout in prayer, yet all was overshadowed if she failed to bear sons. Her body became a battlefield as surely as any plain where knights clashed. Some died in childbirth, others were cast aside, their honor questioned for matters beyond their control. Their suffering was hidden beneath the grandeur of coronations and feasts. When I ponder those marriages now, I do not see the glittering crowns or splendid banquets. I see instead the shadows of expectation, the tears of queens, and the heavy silence of kings awaiting news from the birthing chamber. Royal marriage was not merely a union of two people, but the fragile bridge upon which dynasties balanced. And though thrones gleamed, the lives behind them often bore the dim light of sacrifice. The Church laid its hand firmly upon the question of kinship, setting rules that reached into every noble household of Europe. At first, marriages within 7 degrees of relation were forbidden, a net so wide that nearly every aristocratic family found itself ensnared. In time, the rule was reduced to 4, yet even then, cousins and distant kin were bound by the prohibition. It was a decree meant to curb inbreeding, but it often brought frustration to families desperate to secure their bloodlines. Among nobles, the problem was especially sharp, for most dynasties were already entangled by centuries of intermarriage. I recall hearing of lords who traced their ancestry through labyrinths of cousins, only to discover that nearly every suitable match fell within the forbidden bounds. In such cases, hope rested upon papal dispensations, purchased with coin, loyalty, or political advantage. A parchment from Rome could turn what was once sinful into sanctioned. These dispensations became both blessing and burden. For kings and princes, they offered a way to bend holy law to political necessity. Yet they also revealed the Church's hand in worldly affairs, for no exception came freely. Gold filled the coffers of bishops, and favors were bound to future obedience. Thus, even in matters of love and family, power flowed through the channels of Rome. The rules of kinship were not without reason. Across villages and towns, they served to prevent unions that might weaken communities through too close ties. In rural parishes, priests carefully recorded baptisms and marriages to keep track of who could wed. For ordinary folk, the rules may have limited choice, yet they also safeguarded against the dangers of lineage grown too narrow. The intent, though rigid, held some wisdom. Still, the rigidity often clashed with reality. Nobles could not always afford to look beyond their kin, for alliances had to be drawn close and secure. To marry outside one's circle risked losing land or influence. I remember hearing whispers in great halls of marriages arranged first in secret, later dragged before the courts when bloodlines were questioned. The very rules meant to maintain order often bred discord. For peasants, these restrictions felt less suffocating, though they too could find themselves bound by them. A union between cousins in a small village might be frowned upon, yet often overlooked if necessity pressed. Enforcement was uneven, harsher for the mighty and looser for the humble. In this way, the law revealed itself not only as holy decree, but as an instrument of politics and class. The hypocrisy was not lost on those who watched. Families saw the rich purchase exemptions, while the poor bore the full weight of the rule. Resentment simmered quietly, though few dared voice it aloud. The church stood as both guardian of morality and merchant of exceptions, shaping the very bloodlines of Europe through its judgments. The balance between faith and expedience was thin indeed. As I sit now beside the fire, I think of how these laws of kinship shaped generations. They were chains woven of scripture and coin, limiting love and dictating destiny. Behind the grandeur of noble unions lay countless calculations of blood and law, and though centuries have passed, the echoes remain, reminding us how power once reached into the most intimate bonds of human life. Across the kingdoms I traversed, the joining of two families was as much about land and inheritance as it was about ceremony. Estates shifted hands not through conquest alone, but through carefully arranged unions, with each marriage sealing the fate of fields, villages, and castles. A noble bride carried with her more than a dowry. She carried claims, rights, and the possibility of future disputes. Marriage thus became a mechanism by which wealth and power flowed as surely as rivers across the countryside. For noble houses, these unions were vital to maintain or expand influence. A daughter might secure the joining of two estates, consolidating lands that would otherwise remain divided. Sons, too, gained power through the inheritances tied to their wives. Such arrangements often strengthened dynasties, but they also sowed rivalry among branches of the same family. I remember long quarrels that endured for decades, each side invoking the sanctity of marital contracts to press their claims. Among peasants, though the scale was smaller, the principles remained the same. A few acres of fertile soil or rights to graze livestock could determine a family's survival. When a woman married, her property usually became absorbed into her husband's household, a merging that stripped her of independent control. Even small holdings carried weight, for they shaped the livelihood of generations who tilled the same fields. The loss of direct authority was often silent but profound. Widows occupied a peculiar position in this system. Many were entitled to reclaim a portion of their dowry or receive a dower, a share of their husband's property meant to support them. Yet this right was frequently contested by in-laws eager to keep wealth within their grasp. I recall cases where widows sought justice in both secular and ecclesiastical courts, clinging to parchments that promised them security. Their victories were rare, but their persistence revealed the quiet strength of survival. The legal structures that governed these rights varied widely. In some regions, customary law dictated the flow of inheritance, while elsewhere, canon law intervened to determine legitimacy. A marriage deemed invalid could unravel entire estates, leaving children disinherited and families undone. Courts became battlegrounds as fierce as any field of war, where words and seals carried the weight of swords. Property was the true prize, and marriage its gatekeeper. This system underscored the deep inequalities between men and women. A husband's authority absorbed nearly all assets, leaving his wife dependent upon his will. Even when women acted as stewards in their husband's absence, their power was often temporary, vanishing once a male heir reached age. Yet there were rare exceptions. Noble women who defended castles, managed vast estates, and stood as regents. Their influence flickered like a flame in the wind, remarkable but fragile. Inheritance disputes often erupted upon a patriarch's death, with multiple heirs contesting what had been secured through marriage. Brothers fought brothers, cousins sued cousins, and alliances splintered beneath the weight of property claims. These conflicts revealed how fragile the order truly was, built not upon affection, but upon parchment and possession. Marriage, meant to unite, frequently became the spark for division. When I ponder these memories, I see marriage less as a sacred vow and more as the hinge upon which property turned. Behind every union lay calculations of land, legacy, and wealth. What might appear as festivity to the crowd was, in truth, the careful rearrangement of power. And though hearts may have beat beneath the robes and crowns, it was the soil itself that determined the worth of the union. In the writings of the Church, consent was declared essential, a free yes spoken by both bride and groom to make the union valid. Yet in the world I walked, that freedom was often little more than a whisper drowned by louder voices. Families, lords, and communities pressed heavily upon those of marrying age, leaving little space for the heart to speak. Consent was a principle revered in doctrine, but fragile in practice. Among nobles, the matter was even more complex. Young women were rarely asked what they desired, for their future had already been settled by fathers and uncles long before. The altar became a stage upon which obedience was expected, not choice. I remember seeing brides trembling, their silence mistaken for consent, their reluctance overlooked in the urgency of alliance. Few dared to resist, for disobedience could mean disgrace or even ruin for their kin. For peasants, the pressure was less about dynastic strategy, but no less binding. Families needed security, and marriage offered survival through shared labor and resources. Sons and daughters were urged into unions that promised stability, sometimes against their own inclinations. The voice of the community carried great weight, for an unmarried person was seen as incomplete, an outsider to the fabric of village life. In such a world, refusal was a luxury few could afford. There are rare accounts of defiance, moments when a bride refused at the very altar. Such events caused scandal, disrupting not only families but entire communities. The Church, while upholding the idea of free will, often struggled when confronted with such rebellion. More often than not, the pressure of parents and neighbors soon bent the will of the young back toward conformity. A single act of refusal could echo for years, a reminder of courage paid dearly. Secret marriages also found their place in these times, unions formed without parental blessing, but bound by mutual will. Such unions tested the courts, forcing judges to weigh private vows against the demands of families. Some were upheld, others dissolved, but each revealed how fragile and contested the notion of consent truly was. The struggle between personal choice and social expectation was never fully resolved. Coercion often came not as outright force, but as quiet inevitability. A daughter raised from childhood to believe her worth lay in obedience found little room to imagine otherwise. A son taught that duty to family outweighed personal longing could scarcely step aside from the path laid before him. These patterns of thought shaped countless unions, where acceptance was less a choice than a learned surrender. The Church, for all its teaching, rarely protected the weak from such coercion. Its courts emphasized the words spoken at the altar, not the pressures that led there. A bride who uttered the vows was considered to have given her consent, no matter the weight of silence behind her words. Thus, the law and the heart often walked in separate directions, leaving many trapped within bonds not freely chosen. When I recall the marriages of that age, I do not see joyful affirmations, but quiet acquiescence. Consent existed in theory, but in practice it bent beneath the demands of family, society, and survival. The smile of a bride might hide resignation, and the steady gaze of a groom might mask the loss of dreams unspoken. The union was sealed, yet the freedom within it was too often little more than an illusion. In the world I knew, the songs of love were sung by troubadours, not by husbands and wives. Romance, when it appeared, belonged to poetry, whispered in gardens or celebrated in verse, yet rarely found its home in the marriage bed. Unions were forged for land, for wealth, for stability, leaving little room for affection to guide the hand of choice. Love might grow in time, like ivy creeping across stone, but seldom was it the foundation of the bond. Among nobles, passion often lived outside marriage. Courtly love flourished in secret letters and stolen glances, celebrated as an art of longing rather than fulfillment. Knights pledged loyalty to ladies who were not their wives, crafting songs of devotion that reached far beyond the walls of duty. These romances, admired in tales, were tolerated because they did not threaten the structure of alliance. Love was admired in stories, but it was rarely allowed to govern life. One cannot forget the tale of Heloise and Peter Abelard, whose devotion defied the expectations of their age. Their love was so fierce it survived scandal, exile, and tragedy, though it cost them dearly. Heloise resisted the path of forced marriage, choosing instead the peril of loyalty to her heart. Their story is a rare glimpse of passion triumphing, though at the price of suffering that endured to the end of their days. For most, affection was expected to emerge only after vows were spoken. A husband and wife might, through years of shared labour and burden, learn to find warmth in each other's presence. Love, when it appeared, was more often the fruit of endurance than the seed of union. I saw couples in the fields whose laughter hinted at such bonds, though it came not from choice, but from time's slow weaving. The church itself warned against passion as the root of union, fearing that desire could lead to sin and instability. Marriage was praised not as a sanctuary for love, but as a safeguard for order and lineage. To wed for romance alone was seen as reckless, a folly unworthy of Christian life. Thus, even where hearts yearned, the weight of doctrine pressed them back toward obedience. Yet longing found its ways into expression. Poems carried by wandering minstrels celebrated loves that could not be, turning private ache into public song. Women and men alike listened with a quiet ache, knowing the truth of those verses, even as their lives denied them. The words gave voice to what could not be spoken openly, and in their beauty lay a hidden defiance against the coldness of custom. Peasants, bound more by necessity than nobility, occasionally chose partners with affection in mind. Still, survival often overruled desire, for hunger and hardship were crueler than loneliness. Yet in the small gestures of daily toil, bread baked, hands held after labour, love could quietly flourish. It did not resemble the verses of the troubadours, but it was no less real, born of endurance and kindness in harsh conditions. When I recall those unions, I see love as a flicker against the dark weight of expectation. Rare, fragile, often hidden, yet powerful enough to endure in memory. It was not the foundation of most marriages, but when it appeared, it shone all the brighter for its rarity. Against the silence of duty, the whisper of true affection was a song remembered long after the feast was done. The life of a wife in my age was marked by duty above all else. She was expected to be obedient, pious, and industrious, her days consumed by the needs of household and family. In noble halls, this meant overseeing servants, managing supplies, and ensuring that the family's honour remained untarnished. In cottages and farms, it meant working alongside her husband in the fields, tending animals, and caring for children. Her identity was bound so tightly to her role that few saw her beyond it. Among noble women, responsibilities could stretch even further. When their husbands rode to war or managed distant lands, they often acted as regents, wielding authority that surprised those who underestimated them. I recall hearing of women who defended castles, negotiated with neighbouring lords, and kept estates from collapse in times of absence. Their strength was undeniable, yet it was considered an extension of their husband's power rather than their own. For peasant women, marriage meant unending labor. From dawn until dusk they carried water, prepared food, and labored in the fields with little respite. Their marriages were partnerships in survival, every task shared between man and woman. Yet even here, authority leaned toward the husband, for custom and law reinforced his control over decisions. The wife's effort was essential, but her voice often carried less weight. Children were the central expectation, and with them came both pride and peril. A woman's worth was tied to her ability to produce heirs, especially sons. Many risked their lives in childbirth repeatedly, for mortality was high, and the cycle of pregnancy unrelenting. The joy of new life was shadowed by the constant threat of death, and too many women were remembered only for the children they bore. Religion shaped much of their existence. Preachers praised women for their submission and chastity, presenting Mary, Mother of Christ, as their model. Yet behind these ideals, real women bore struggles of fatigue, grief, and endurance. Confessionals were filled with their quiet sorrows, their burdens often invisible to the men who dictated their roles. In the sermons I heard, obedience was praised louder than compassion for their suffering. Despite restrictions, some women found ways to exert influence. In markets, wives conducted trade, bartered goods, and kept household economies afloat. Noble women sometimes arranged marriages for their children, or brokered alliances on behalf of their families. These actions, though often dismissed, reveal the resilience of women navigating a world that sought to confine them. Their agency was subtle, but it was not absent. Still, law and custom rarely recognized them as independent beings. Upon marriage, their property became their husband's, their legal standing often diminished. A widow might briefly regain authority, but even that was precarious, vulnerable to the claims of male relatives. Women moved through life with limited autonomy, their paths hemmed by structures they did not design. Their resilience lay in survival within these boundaries. When I reflect upon their lives, I see a quiet heroism often left unspoken in chronicles. They bore the weight of households, nurtured generations, and endured trials that tested the limits of body and spirit. Though their names are seldom carved into stone, the strength of medieval society rested upon their shoulders. Their role was defined by others, yet their endurance gave it meaning beyond measure. The vows spoken before altar and priest promised harmony, yet within many homes, silence bore witness to cruelty. Husbands were granted authority not only over property, but over the very bodies of their wives. Discipline was tolerated, sometimes even encouraged, under the belief that a man's household must remain firmly under his hand. The line between guidance and abuse was easily crossed, and too often, no one intervened. In law, husbands were permitted a measure of correction. Only when the blows became excessive might neighbors or clerics take notice, but even then, justice was uncertain. The courts rarely offered women true refuge, for their testimony was doubted and their status diminished. A wife who suffered in silence was seen as dutiful. One who protested risked dishonor or exile. I saw many carry bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, their pain unspoken. Among the poor, hardship and violence often walked together. Hunger, exhaustion, and desperation fed tempers already strained by toil. A peasant wife endured not only the labor of the field, but the volatility of a husband burdened by survival. Among nobles, the cruelty took other forms: confinement, public humiliation, or the stripping away of dowry and dignity. In both huts and castles, women were vulnerable, their voices seldom heard. The church urged harmony, speaking of marriage as a sacred bond built on mutual respect. Yet in practice, it rarely shielded women from abuse. Priests preached patience and forgiveness, urging wives to endure for the sake of family and salvation. Intervention was rare, and when it came, it sought reconciliation more than protection. The weight of Scripture often fell heavier upon the injured than upon the offender. Still, there were moments when the veil of tolerance lifted. Records tell of wives who sought judgment in ecclesiastical courts, appealing to bishops for relief. Some succeeded, though most were told to return to their husbands with renewed obedience. A few fled to convents, seeking safety within cloistered walls, trading one form of confinement for another. Their stories reveal both desperation and remarkable courage. It was not only physical harm that marked these unions, but emotional cruelty as well. Neglect, scorn, and abandonment cut as deeply as the lash. A wife deprived of affection, cast aside for another, or shamed before her kin endured wounds that left no scar upon the skin. I saw how silence grew thick in such households, where words of love were replaced by orders and companionship turned to fear. Some men did treat their wives with kindness, and in those rare homes, harmony was real. But they stood against the tide of expectation, their gentleness seen by others as weakness. The structures of society supported control, not compassion, and those who defied that order risked mockery or suspicion. Such examples were the exception, not the rule, though they offered glimpses of what might have been. When I remember the marriages of my time, I cannot ignore the shadows that lay behind gilded veils and humble hearths. Violence was not the whole of every union, but its presence was common enough to darken the promise of vows. The fire beside me tonight burns with a gentleness that many women of that age never knew. Its warmth reminds me of what marriage could have been, had compassion been valued above dominion. The word adultery carried heavy weight in the world I once walked, though its burden did not fall equally upon men and women. For wives, even the suspicion of infidelity was enough to stain their honor, threaten their children's legitimacy, and invite harsh punishment. Husbands, however, often strayed with less fear, their actions condemned in sermons, but tolerated in practice. The law was written with one hand for men and another for women. For noble women, the stakes were perilous. Their fidelity safeguarded the certainty of succession, and any doubt could unravel dynasties. A queen accused of betrayal faced not only disgrace, but often death, her body and reputation sacrificed to protect the crown. In later years, Anne Boleyn's fate would echo this truth, but her story was only the loudest of many whispered through time. The throne left little room for mercy. Among common folk, the punishments were severe, though less spectacular. A woman caught in adultery might be paraded through the streets, her shame displayed before neighbors who had once shared her bread. The gossip that followed lingered for years, destroying chances for acceptance or security. Men, meanwhile, could often return to their households with little more than confession, their sins washed away while the woman's endured. The church condemned adultery for both sexes, speaking of it as mortal sin. Yet, in confessionals, I saw how absolution came easier to men, who were counseled to repent and turn their hearts anew. For women, forgiveness was offered, but rarely freed them from earthly consequences. Their lives bore the weight of both sin and judgment, leaving them trapped between spiritual hope and social ruin. Troubadour songs and tales sometimes celebrated forbidden love, romanticizing what society condemned. Yet these verses were indulgences of fantasy, not reflections of accepted life. They offered a brief escape into the idea that passion might triumph over duty, but in reality, such defiance carried bitter cost. Behind every whispered ballad lay the unspoken truth. To act on such desires was to gamble one's life and legacy. Men of power often flaunted mistresses openly, their households turning a blind eye so long as alliances remained intact. Kings and lords fathered children beyond wedlock, acknowledging them when it suited political advantage. These double standards revealed the deep inequity within the institution, where the same act could elevate or destroy depending on who committed it. Honor was guarded fiercely in women, while men's transgressions were quietly excused. I recall seeing wives accused not only by evidence, but by rumor alone, their voices drowned out by the authority of husbands and councils. Rarely were their words believed, And even when they were, reconciliation was difficult to find. The stain of accusation lingered, regardless of truth. A man's power shielded him. A woman's vulnerability condemned her. The imbalance was woven into the very fabric of law and custom. Looking back, the story of adultery in my age was less about sin than about control. It was a mirror reflecting the fear of uncertain lineage and the determination of men to guard their bloodlines at all costs. Women bore the weight of these fears, often paying with their freedom or their lives. As the fire warms me tonight, I cannot help but wonder how different the world might have been if faithfulness had been measured equally for all. The Church declared marriage a sacred bond, one that no earthly power should sever. Divorce, as we know it now, did not exist in my time, for the vows were meant to last until death. Yet beneath this ideal, life was more complicated, and the cracks in many unions gave rise to desperate appeals. Annulment became the only path to freedom, though it was a privilege few could ever hope to obtain. To secure an annulment, one had to prove the marriage had never truly existed in the eyes of God. Reasons varied: consanguinity not revealed before, failure to consummate the union, or lack of proper consent. These claims often required testimony, sometimes humiliatingly intimate, laid bare before ecclesiastical courts. The process was long, costly, and humiliating, reminding all that freedom was a luxury reserved for the wealthy and powerful. Noble families wielded annulments as political weapons. When alliances soured or heirs failed to appear, old kinship ties were suddenly discovered, or claims of coercion were brought forth. A union once celebrated with pomp could be erased with parchment and seal, if the right influence reached Rome. Kings and lords used this to reshape their futures, while ordinary folk remained bound with no hope of release. The tale of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon came after my time, yet its roots lay firmly in the medieval system. His plea for annulment, grounded in claims of kinship, tore apart Christendom when Rome refused him. But long before Henry, many lesser nobles sought the same, exploiting the same loopholes to dissolve unwanted bonds. The Church, in granting or denying, wielded immense power over the destiny of kingdoms. For commoners, separation was rare and fraught with danger. A woman might appeal for relief from abuse, but more often she was counseled to endure for the sake of family and faith. Husbands too could find themselves trapped, though the weight fell far more heavily upon wives. The rigidity of doctrine bound them tightly, with little chance to escape even the most painful marriages. The cost of annulment was not only measured in coin, but in scandal. To question a marriage was to question the legitimacy of children, the stability of inheritance, and the honor of families. Lawsuits erupted, villages whispered, and reputations crumbled under the shadow of broken vows. Many chose endurance over exposure, suffering silently rather than risk the ruin of public trial. Still, the very existence of annulments revealed a contradiction. The Church proclaimed indissolubility, yet carved narrow doors for escape when politics demanded it. Holiness and expedience often walked uneasily together, the one cloaked in doctrine, the other in necessity. What was denied to the poor was granted to the powerful, exposing the deep inequality hidden beneath the language of faith. When I reflect upon it, I see how fragile the idea of permanence truly was. The vows of marriage were exalted as eternal, yet easily bent by coin, power, or necessity. Many lived bound by chains they could not break, while a few slipped free through the cracks in law. The promise of indissoluble union was real enough in word, but in practice, it bowed before the weight of ambition. In village squares and cathedral doors alike, weddings carried a language of ritual that spoke louder than words. The exchange of vows was not only a bond between two people, but a performance witnessed by community and heaven alike. From the binding of hands to the blessing at the church door, every gesture carried meaning shaped by centuries of belief. These rites turned necessity into ceremony, cloaking obligation with a mantle of the sacred. The custom of hand fasting, where hands were tied with cord or cloth, symbolized the binding of two lives into one. I saw it performed in humble cottages and noble halls, always with the same quiet gravity. Rings too held power, circles of metal without end, representing eternity. The poorest might carve a band of wood, while the wealthiest displayed gold and jewels, yet both bore the same sign of permanence. Priests often performed the blessing outside the church, rather than within, at the very threshold. This act symbolized the crossing from one life into another, from the father's household into the husband's. The doors of the church stood as the witness of heaven, and to pass them was to step into a new existence. The place itself became a metaphor for transformation, sacred and social at once. Feasts that followed were not mere celebrations, but affirmations of community. Neighbors gathered, sharing bread and ale, dancing long into the night. These gatherings served to mark acceptance, for a marriage unacknowledged by the village was incomplete. Even the humblest families spared what they could, for the feast announced to all that the union was sealed and honored. Laughter and song became part of the contract. Among nobles, the pageantry was breathtaking. Trumpets announced the procession, banners flew, and gifts were exchanged before throngs of courtiers. Every detail was meant to display wealth, power, and piety, for marriages at such heights were spectacles of authority. Yet beneath the grandeur, the rituals remained the same as those of peasants, the same vows spoken, the same blessings sought. The universality of these acts bound all classes together. Traces of older customs lingered within the Christian forms. Pagan rites of fertility and protection were woven into blessings, candles lit against evil, and dances meant to ensure prosperity. Though the church disapproved, it tolerated much, for people clung to traditions that comforted them. Thus, ancient practices survived beneath the cloak of Christian ritual, carried forward in secret gestures and whispered prayers. The symbolism of the ceremonies reinforced not only spiritual meaning, but the reality of social order. The bride was transferred from one family to another, her identity reshaped in public. The husband took her hand before all, signifying his authority and her obedience. The entire community bore witness, ensuring the union was not private affection, but a public contract. Ritual transformed personal change into collective recognition. When I think of those weddings, I remember both the solemn vows and the joyous feasts. They were moments where the burdens of duty were softened by the beauty of tradition. Though love was not always present, the rituals gave weight and dignity to the bond. And as the bells tolled above the village or city, they carried across fields and forests the reminder that marriage bound not just two lives, but the world around them. A marriage spoken in words and blessed by priest was not yet complete until the act of consummation sealed it. Without this union of bodies, the vows could be questioned, and the legitimacy of children cast into doubt. Entire inheritances depended on this private moment, and yet it was treated as a matter of public concern. The most intimate act of life was transformed into proof of obligation, weighed and measured by society. In noble courts, this proof was sometimes demanded openly. Witnesses might escort the couple to their chamber, waiting outside until the ritual was complete. In some cases, garments or bed linens were displayed the following day, tokens meant to silence doubt. What should have been private was made a spectacle, ensuring that no claim could later threaten inheritance or alliance. I remember the unease such customs brought, though few dared to resist them. Failure to consummate could lead to annulment, no matter how grand the ceremony had been. Husbands accused of impotence found their names dragged through ecclesiastical courts, forced to endure humiliating examinations and testimonies. Wives, too, could be condemned if suspicion of resistance arose. The weight of legitimacy hung so heavily that even the silence of the marriage bed became grounds for scandal. Queens carried the heaviest burden of all. Their fertility determined the survival of dynasties, and consummation was proof that heirs could one day be born. Catherine of Aragon's early years with Arthur Tudor stand as an example, for the question of whether their union was ever consummated shaped the fate of England itself. Such private details became matters of state, argued before kings, popes, and parliaments. Among peasants, the scrutiny was less formal, but the expectation was the same. A union without consummation was no true marriage in the eyes of neighbours. Gossip carried weight, and a barren bed might stain reputations for generations. Children were the true measure of marriage's success, and without them, couples found themselves pitied, judged, or even shunned. Fertility was the silent contract that underpinned every union. The emphasis on legitimacy was tied directly to inheritance. A son born outside recognized wedlock had little claim, no matter how noble his blood. Illegitimacy was a mark that could not be erased, barring entry to titles and estates. Fathers and mothers alike lived under the shadow of this law, for without legitimate heirs, their line and their property were at risk. The Church upheld these expectations with unwavering firmness. Priests declared the union holy only when consummation confirmed it, and canon law bound inheritance to that standard. Even spiritual guidance could not shield couples from the gaze of law and community. The doctrine of sacrament wrapped itself around the act, making it both duty and necessity. What was sacred became inseparable from what was practical. When I reflect upon this, I see how power invaded even the quietest moments of life. A marriage bed was not truly a sanctuary, but another stage upon which society placed its demands. Consummation was more than intimacy. It was proof, protection, and peril all at once. And though the fire burns softly tonight, I cannot forget how many lives were shaped by the weight of expectation carried into that chamber. Far from the castles and courts, marriage among the peasantry was bound to the rhythm of fields and seasons. These unions were not arranged for dynastic ambition, but for survival, where two hands became stronger when joined. A man and woman married not to expand kingdoms, but to share the burden of labor, to till the soil together, and to raise children who could one day carry on the work. Marriage here was less spectacle, more necessity, woven into the very fabric of daily life. The ceremony, though humbler, still carried weight. Villages gathered in celebration, often after harvest when stores were full enough to allow for feasting. Ale was brewed, bread was broken, and the community itself bore witness to the vows. The joy was simple, yet no less profound, for these gatherings reinforced bonds among neighbors. A wedding was not only between two people, but between families and the land they shared. Among serfs, the story took a different shape. Their marriages were subject to the approval of their lord, for the union of two serfs determined obligations upon the manor. A lord might demand a fee, known as merchet, to permit the union, further binding peasants to the land. The choice of spouse was thus never entirely free, shaped as much by feudal obligations as by personal inclination. Marriage was at once personal and political, even at the lowest ranks. Dowries and gifts existed in these circles as well, though modest compared to nobility. A goat, a chest of tools, or rights to a small strip of land might accompany a bride. Such exchanges carried enormous significance, for even the humblest possessions could mean survival through the harsh winters. Families stretched themselves thin to provide for their daughters, echoing on a smaller scale the burdens of the great houses. Love, though seldom the basis for noble marriages, found more room to breathe among peasants. With fewer dynastic constraints, some couples chose each other for affection as well as necessity. Their bonds, while tested by hardship, sometimes grew into partnerships of genuine warmth. I remember seeing a man and wife laboring together in the fields, their laughter rising above the toil, proof that even in scarcity, tenderness could survive. Still, the hardships of peasant life left little space for dreams. Disease, famine, and war often shattered families, leaving widows and orphans to struggle on alone. A second marriage might follow quickly, not out of romance, but out of need, for no household could endure long without both hands at work. In this way, unions were as fragile as they were vital, constantly shaped by the demands of survival. Custom and community ensured that marriage remained central to village identity. To be unmarried was to stand apart, viewed with suspicion or pity. The expectation was universal: to join with another, to raise children, and to contribute to the rhythm of the village. In this way, marriage was less about personal choice and more about belonging, a thread that tied individuals into the greater weave of rural life. When I recall these unions, I see not grandeur or politics, but quiet endurance. The flicker of a hearth, the clatter of tools, the sound of children's laughter amid labour. Peasant marriages lacked the luxury of freedom, yet within their simplicity lay a resilience unmatched. Their vows were not recorded in gilded ledgers, but in the furrows of fields and the sweat of survival, where the bond of two lives meant the difference between hunger and hope. In the feudal world I once walked, even the most private bonds of life were subject to the lord's authority. Among serfs, marriage was not wholly their own, for it touched directly upon the rights of the manor. A fee known as merchet was often required when a daughter married, a payment to compensate the lord for the loss of her labour. The coin or goods exchanged were reminders that peasants' lives were never entirely free. This practice pressed heavily upon poor families. To see a daughter wed meant parting not only with her presence, but with wealth scraped together for the lord's due. Some delayed marriages for years, struggling to meet the demand, while others saw their children's unions postponed indefinitely. The merchet became yet another burden binding peasants to the land, a reminder that their choices were filtered through permission and payment. Alongside the reality of merchet arose the legend of the droit du seigneur, the supposed right of a lord to claim a bride on her wedding night. Though tales of this practice have endured, most scholars of my time dismissed it as rumour rather than fact. It was a story that revealed fears of domination more than common truth, for no widespread record confirms its reality. Yet the myth itself carried power, shaping how peasants spoke of their subjugation. The endurance of the tale shows how deeply lord's authority was felt. Even if the right was never exercised, the very belief that it could be symbolized the imbalance of feudal life. Power was not only wielded in taxes and laws, but in the imagination of the oppressed. A lord's shadow hung over hearths and marriages, whether by coin demanded or rumour feared. I recall hearing peasants grumble about these obligations in hushed tones, never loud enough to risk punishment. For them, marriage was not simply a union of hearts or even families, but another transaction overseen by authority. The bride carried not just a dowry to her husband's house, but also the memory of coin handed over to the manor. Her new life began already marked by the economics of her old one. Among nobles and clergy, these customs were often defended as necessary order. Lords claimed that the merchet preserved stability, ensuring that manorial obligations did not diminish when women married beyond the estate. Yet for the peasants themselves, it was exploitation disguised as tradition. It revealed clearly that even in the most personal of unions, freedom was compromised by hierarchy. These practices also highlight how marriage reflected the broader inequalities of the age. The wealthy arranged dynastic unions with priests and popes, while the poor begged permission from their lords. In both cases, power dictated the terms, though at different scales. Marriage was never entirely private. It was woven into the web of obligations that defined medieval life. As I sit now by the quiet fire, I cannot help but see these customs as chains laid across the hearts of ordinary men and women. The merchet was real, the droit du seigneur perhaps myth, yet both reveal the same truth. Marriage under feudalism bore the weight of domination. Even joy was shadowed by authority, reminding all that in our world, nothing, even love, escaped the reach of power. When armies crossed borders and kingdoms collided, marriage became a bridge between cultures as well as families. I witnessed how unions formed not only within familiar lands, but across divides of language, custom, and faith. In the courts of Europe, princesses from Byzantium or distant realms were given in marriage to Western rulers, bringing with them traditions unfamiliar yet alluring. These unions carried both promise and peril, blending identities in ways that could unite or unsettle entire realms. In the wake of the Crusades, some knights established themselves in the Holy Land, where they took wives from among local Christian communities or widows of fallen lords. These marriages secured legitimacy and land, ensuring that European authority could take root in foreign soil. They also created households where Latin and Eastern customs mingled, each partner shaping the other's world. Such unions were as political as they were personal, meant to hold fragile states together. Byzantine princesses, renowned for their refinement and wealth, often found themselves wed to Western nobles seeking prestige. I remember hearing tales of how their arrival transformed courts with new fashions, foods, and manners. Yet beneath the splendor lay tension, for the values of East and West did not always align. Cultural pride clashed with expectation, and marriages meant to cement alliances sometimes deepened divisions. In Spain and Sicily, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities coexisted uneasily, intermarriage appeared in rare but significant moments. Such unions often required conversion, for the Church frowned heavily upon bonds that crossed religious lines. Still, they occurred, reflecting the reality of shared lands and lives. These marriages stood as fragile testaments to coexistence, though they carried risks of suspicion and social rejection. Even within Christendom, differences of custom marked these alliances. A bride from Provence brought songs and dialects to the cold courts of the north. A German groom introduced rigid traditions to softer southern lands. In their households, servants, food, and ceremony revealed the blending of worlds. Children of such unions embodied new identities, heirs to more than one culture, sometimes seen as bridges, other times as outsiders. Political necessity drove many of these arrangements. A king might seek to secure peace by wedding his daughter to a rival house in another land, binding enemies into kin. Treaties signed in ink were fragile, but those sealed in blood often endured longer. Still, peace was never guaranteed, for resentments simmered beneath the surface, and unions meant to heal wounds could just as easily reopen them. For the women given in such marriages, the burden was immense. Torn from familiar lands, they carried the weight of expectation to embody loyalty to two worlds at once. Some thrived, mastering new languages and customs, while others lived in isolation, strangers in courts that never fully welcomed them. Their lives remind us that behind every political alliance stood a woman navigating a foreign world with quiet resilience. When I reflect on these unions, I see them as mirrors of Europe itself, diverse, fractured, yet bound by necessity. Marriage became a vessel for diplomacy, carrying both trust and mistrust across borders. And though the feasts and ceremonies spoke of unity, the true work was lived daily in households where difference and sameness struggled to find harmony. These bonds tell us that even in an age of division, lives could still entwine across the boundaries of culture. The death of a husband transformed a woman's life in an instant, yet widowhood was not always the end of her influence. In many parts of Europe, a widow could claim her dower rights, a portion of her late husband's property meant to sustain her. This share granted her a rare independence, though it was often contested by in-laws eager to reclaim wealth. The struggle for survival began anew, but with it came a measure of authority she had not known in marriage. Some widows rose to positions of remarkable power. Noblewomen sometimes governed estates in their own name, overseeing vassals, collecting rents, and managing lands while their sons were still too young to rule. They became guardians of dynasties, their signatures carrying weight in contracts and treaties. Yet this authority was often temporary, vanishing once male heirs reached maturity. Still, in those years, widows shaped the course of their families and regions. For many, the pressure to remarry came swiftly. Families sought to bind widows into new unions that preserved alliances or restored stability. Even queens were not spared. Their remarriage often became a matter of state, calculated to secure borders or claims. Personal grief found little space amid these demands, as the widow's body and fortune were again treated as instruments of policy. The cycle of duty rarely paused for mourning. Others, however, chose a different path. Convents opened their doors to widows seeking refuge from remarriage. Cloistered life offered not only spiritual purpose, but also freedom from the obligations of family strategy. In the quiet of monasteries, some women found solace, their days filled with prayer rather than politics. The veil, though restrictive, gave them an escape from the relentless expectations of secular life. Among peasants, widowhood carried harsher realities. Without a husband's labor, survival became precarious, and many remarried quickly out of necessity rather than desire. A widow with children faced the burden of providing for all, often relying on extended kin or the goodwill of neighbors. Some found companionship in second unions, while others endured marriages of convenience that offered stability without affection. Survival once again dictated choice. The law sometimes favored widows, granting them rights to remain in their homes or claim portions of land. Yet these protections varied widely, and in practice, women often faced resistance. I recall hearing of widows pleading before courts, parchments in hand, their voices strained by both grief and determination. Their persistence reveals the fragile balance between legal promise and lived reality. Cultural attitudes toward widows were complex. Some were respected as wise and experienced, bearers of memory and stability. Others were viewed with suspicion, their independence seen as threatening in a patriarchal world. Stories and superstitions occasionally painted widows as dangerous or unlucky, reflections of a society uneasy with women who stood outside the bonds of male control. Respect and mistrust walked side by side. As I sit now with the fire's glow upon my face, I recall widowhood not only as a state of loss, but as a threshold. It was a moment when women, bound all their lives by duty to husband and family, sometimes found a fleeting freedom. Whether through estate, convent, or remarriage, each path revealed both the burdens and resilience of women in that age. Their lives, shaped by grief, remind us how survival and strength often rose together from the ashes of loss. In every hall and village I passed through, the measure of a marriage lay not in affection, but in children. To wed was to promise life to the lineage, and without offspring, a union was considered incomplete. The birth of sons in particular was celebrated, for they carried the family's name and secured its inheritance. Daughters too were valued, though often for the alliances they might one day bring. Fertility was not simply desired, it was demanded. The burden of this expectation fell most heavily upon women. A wife who bore no children was often blamed, regardless of her husband's health or strength. Whispers grew around her, doubts settled like shadows, and her place in the household weakened. In noble courts, the failure to produce an heir could bring annulment or disgrace, while in peasant homes it meant vulnerability to hunger and loss. A woman's worth was tethered to her womb. Among the great families of Europe, queens and noblewomen were scrutinized with relentless eyes. The birthing chamber was not a private refuge, but a stage upon which the destiny of kingdoms unfolded. Midwives, courtiers, and even chroniclers bore witness, for the arrival of a child carried consequences far beyond the household. To fail in this sacred duty was to place dynasties at risk, a weight no woman should have borne alone. Peasants, though free of dynastic concerns, lived under the same pressure in harsher form. Children were labor for the fields, caretakers for aging parents, and assurance against famine. Large families meant survival, and each new birth was both a joy and a necessity. Yet the toll upon mothers was heavy, for childbirth was dangerous, and many women gave their lives in the act meant to secure their family's future. Medical understanding was shaped by humoral theory, placing blame upon women for infertility more often than men. Remedies ranged from herbal concoctions to superstitions whispered at night, but few truly helped. Men who could not father children were seldom shamed in the same way. The silence of society shielded them, while women bore the weight of accusation. The imbalance revealed how deeply culture and ignorance intertwined. legitimacy was tied directly to fertility, for without heirs, land and titles might pass to rival branches. Disputes erupted when marriages failed to produce offspring, leading to battles both in courts and on battlefields. The hope of continuity drove families to desperation, and some sought papal permission to dissolve unions in pursuit of more fruitful ones. Bloodlines were fragile threads, stretched to breaking by the demand for heirs. The Church reinforced these expectations, preaching that marriage's highest purpose was procreation. Sermons reminded couples that their union was not for pleasure, but for the creation of souls to serve God. Families absorbed this teaching, weaving it into their daily lives until it became unquestioned truth. To marry and not bear children was seen as defiance against divine order. The pressure grew not only from society, but from heaven itself. As I recall these customs, I hear in them the unyielding demand of continuity. Children were blessings, yet they were also burdens, their absence a curse upon those who longed for them. Behind every cradle stood both joy and fear, the promise of tomorrow and the shadow of expectation. The fire warms me tonight, but it cannot soften the memory of how much of life was measured by the cries of the newborn. In the world I knew, the body was understood through the teachings of Galen and the balance of humours. Marriage itself was often described as a remedy, a way to regulate desire and ensure health. Physicians wrote that a harmonious union kept the blood and bile in order, preventing melancholy or imbalance. Even within this framework of limited knowledge, marriage was treated as medicine for both soul and flesh, though always with greater weight placed upon the woman. Infertility was a fear that haunted households, and physicians devised countless cures. Women were given herbal mixtures of fennel, rue, or sage, while charms and rituals were whispered alongside them. Midwives, more trusted by the people than scholars, often carried remedies rooted in both tradition and experience. Some worked, many did not, yet hope kept such practices alive. Behind each attempt lay the heavy expectation of heirs. The health of women was bound closely to their roles as wives. Menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth were constant subjects of medical speculation. Physicians argued that frequent intercourse kept women's humours balanced, while childbearing was seen as their natural cure for illness. To refuse these duties was considered harmful to their very nature. Thus, medicine was used to justify the roles already demanded by society. Childbirth remained perilous, and I saw many women lose their lives upon the birthing bed. Midwives attended with skill, yet even their experience could not always overcome the dangers of infection and hemorrhage. Prayers and relics were brought into the chamber, for faith often accompanied medicine. The survival of mother and child was never certain, a truth that cast a shadow over every celebration of marriage. For men, medical thought carried different concerns. Excessive desire outside marriage was said to lead to madness or physical decay, while within marriage it was framed as natural and healthful. Adultery was condemned morally, but also explained as destructive to the body. Such teachings reinforced the idea that marriage was not only duty, but cure, binding together medicine, morality, and law in one breath. The role of physicians was limited, for most people could not afford their services. Knowledge was carried instead by midwives, herbalists, and healers, who passed down wisdom through generations. Their remedies, though scorned by scholars, often proved more effective in practice. Yet suspicion lingered, and many a wise woman was accused of witchcraft when her skills seemed too extraordinary. Medicine and danger walked hand in hand. Beliefs about fertility shaped how couples lived. Foods were prescribed to increase vigor, while periods of fasting and abstinence tied to the church calendar restricted intimacy. Even the stars and moon were consulted, for astrology was considered a tool of medicine. Thus, marriage and health were entwined with rituals of diet, timing, and superstition. To conceive a child was seen as both science and providence. When I reflect upon those times, I see clearly how fragile knowledge was. Medicine sought to explain and guide, Yet it often bound men and women more tightly to expectations already set by society. The remedies, the prayers, the warnings, all served to remind couples that their health, like their marriage, was never their own alone. It belonged to family, to community, and to the eternal cycle of survival. Though the Church proclaimed celibacy as law for its priests from the 11th century onward, in practice, human frailty often bent those rules. Many clerics continued to take wives or concubines, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. Villagers accepted these unions with a shrug, for a priest with a household seemed no stranger than a farmer with a family. Yet councils thundered against such behavior, condemning it as scandal that threatened the sanctity of holy orders. The Gregorian reforms sought to root out these practices, demanding purity among the clergy. Yet in truth, the enforcement was uneven, shifting from region to region. In some places, bishops turned a blind eye, allowing priests to live quietly with women so long as they served their duties faithfully. In others, harsher measures were taken. Wives driven away, children disinherited, priests humiliated before their congregations. The ideals of Rome clashed constantly with the reality of parish life. Concubinage became the hidden compromise. Unable to marry openly, many priests kept women in their households, calling them servants to avoid scrutiny. These women bore children who often lived in the margins, neither fully acknowledged nor fully rejected. The Church condemned the practice, yet tolerated its persistence, for to remove so many priests from service would have left villages abandoned of spiritual care. It was a hypocrisy lived out in silence. I recall hearing villagers speak kindly of a priest's family, defending them when outsiders criticized. To them, a shepherd with children of his own seemed more trustworthy, more human. Yet to the eyes of authority, such bonds threatened the sacred order of celibacy, a discipline meant to separate clergy from worldly ties. The tension was never resolved, lingering like a shadow across every parish. For the women involved, life was precarious. They were denied the security of lawful marriage, their status uncertain and vulnerable. If the priest turned against them, they had little recourse, and their children often bore the stigma of illegitimacy. Some endured out of affection, others out of necessity, for the stability of a priest's household offered more than poverty might. Still, they lived in the grey margins of acceptance and condemnation. The persistence of clerical unions revealed how doctrine and daily life diverged. Rome could issue decrees, but the countryside followed its own rhythm. Priests were men of flesh and weakness, not angels, and the expectations placed upon them often proved unbearable. The distance between law and practice grew wider with every generation, exposing the frailty of human obedience to lofty ideals. These tensions also fueled wider disputes within the Church itself. Reformers decried corruption and called for stricter discipline, while others argued for leniency and understanding. The struggle between rigidity and compassion became a mirror of the larger conflicts that would one day divide Christendom. Even in this matter of marriage, the seeds of future upheaval were already being sown. When I think on those priests and their households, I see not merely sin, but humanity. The Church sought to strip them of their bonds, yet the bonds persisted, reminding us that love and companionship cannot always be commanded away. The fire beside me tonight flickers with that same truth. Rules may bind the body, but the heart often seeks its own path, even beneath the gaze of heaven. In lands where religions met, the joining of two faiths in marriage stirred more unease than joy. Across Iberia, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived in uneasy proximity, unions that crossed confessional lines were heavily restricted. The Church condemned them as dangerous to the purity of belief, and rulers often forbade them outright. Yet life is rarely as rigid as law, and such marriages did occur, sometimes quietly, sometimes under the watchful eye of conversion. Jewish-Christian unions were among the most fiercely opposed. Canon law forbade them, and councils declared them invalid, fearing they would weaken the faith of Christians. Still, whispers of these marriages reached my ears, often marked by secrecy or flight from hostile communities. Children of such bonds bore the stigma of mistrust, caught between worlds that seldom welcomed them. Love in these cases meant exile as much as companionship. Muslim-Christian marriages carried even greater weight in the era of Reconquista. Victories and conquests brought populations into contact, and rulers sought to regulate the mixing of faiths. A Christian man might wed a converted Muslim woman, but rarely without suspicion. For noble families, these unions could be political tools, designed to secure loyalty from newly conquered lands. Yet for ordinary folk, they brought danger, for neighbours rarely looked kindly on such bonds. Among Eastern Europeans, where Orthodox and Catholic lands touched, interfaith marriages were part of broader rivalries. A noblewoman marrying across the divide was seen as a symbol of alliance or betrayal, depending on the eyes that watched. Such unions revealed how marriage served as diplomacy even within Christendom itself, where theological disputes carved deep fractures. Here, too, suspicion often outweighed trust, and harmony was elusive. The risks fell most heavily upon women. A bride entering the faith of her husband often faced pressure to abandon her own practices entirely. Conversion was not always voluntary, but demanded as the price of acceptance. Those who resisted lived in a liminal state, never fully belonging, always carrying the weight of difference. Their struggles remind me that love seldom erased the boundaries society erected. Communities themselves bore the strain. A union across religions could provoke hostility from neighbours, incite riots, or bring penalties from local rulers. Families might disown the couple, leaving them to survive without the support networks that sustained most medieval households. In a world where survival depended on belonging, to step outside the circle of faith was perilous indeed. Yet not all was conflict. In some rare moments, these marriages created bridges of understanding. Shared households brought new foods, languages, and customs into daily life, weaving together identities richer than either alone. Children raised within them often grew into symbols of possibility, even if they bore the scars of suspicion. Such unions remind us that even in an age of division, human bonds sometimes reached beyond the boundaries of doctrine. As I sit with memory and flame, I see clearly how these marriages reflected the limits of tolerance in the medieval world. They were sparks of connection in a time of suspicion, fragile attempts to unite what kingdoms sought to keep apart. Their rarity does not lessen their meaning, for they show us the courage of those who chose love despite the walls of faith. And though the centuries have passed, their echoes still stir the heart. In the lands carved by the Crusades, marriage became a weapon as sharp as any sword. European lords who established rule in Jerusalem, Antioch, and other Crusader states knew their power rested not only on arms, but on alliances. To marry into local noble families was to secure legitimacy, binding Latin rulers to territories they sought to hold. These unions fused conquest with continuity, giving fragile states a foothold in foreign soil. Many crusaders took brides from among Eastern Christian families, whether Greek Orthodox, Armenian, or Syriac. Such marriages stitched together communities that might otherwise have resisted Latin dominance. A Frankish knight, wedding a local noblewoman, gained not only land, but acceptance within a region wary of outsiders. The household became a place where two traditions coexisted uneasily, yet necessarily, for survival demanded cooperation. Widows played a significant role in these unions. The turmoil of war left many noblewomen without husbands, their estates vulnerable to seizure. Crusaders often married them, inheriting both land and loyalty. These arrangements, while practical, could be fraught with tension, for widows were rarely free to choose. Still, their marriages anchored foreign rulers to the soil they claimed, weaving conquest into local lineage. The influence of Byzantium also shaped these unions. Western lords sometimes sought Byzantine brides, hoping to link their fragile states with the prestige of Constantinople. Such alliances carried both promise and peril, for the schism between East and West simmered beneath every exchange. Marriages that looked like bridges could also become battlegrounds of custom and creed, straining bonds rather than strengthening them. Among common crusaders, marriages with local women were less political, but no less significant. These unions reflected daily life in settlements where Latin, Greek, and Arabic tongues mingled. Some marriages followed conversion, others remained tense compromises within divided households. They reveal the human side of conquest, not only the clash of armies, but the blending of lives beneath the same roof. The Church attempted to regulate these unions, wary of diluting Latin identity. Papal decrees urged settlers to marry within their own faith, and suspicion fell heavily on those who wedded outside it. Yet necessity often outweighed decree, for a lord without heirs or allies could not long endure. The tension between doctrine and reality was constant, echoing through courts and chapels alike. Children of such marriages embodied both hope and uncertainty. To some, they were symbols of unity, heirs to lands that spanned cultures. To others, they were reminders of compromise, their bloodlines questioned by those who feared betrayal of Latin purity. In their lives, we see the complexity of the Crusader states. Never fully European, never fully Eastern, but a blend of both. When I remember these unions, I see how marriage became a tool to plant roots in soil taken by force. Castles and armies held land for a time, but it was households, formed by these alliances, that wove permanence into conquest. Yet permanence proved fragile, for the Crusader states crumbled despite their marriages. They stand as reminders that even when lives joined across cultures, the tide of history was not so easily bound. In the courts of both church and crown, marriage was not simply a private matter, but a legal bond to be defended, disputed, and defined. Secular judges and ecclesiastical authorities alike pored over parchments and testimonies, determining who was truly wed and who lived in sin. From the highest lords to the humblest peasants, disputes over dowries, inheritance, and legitimacy filled the records. Law gave shape to unions, binding them not only in ritual, but in written decree. Ecclesiastical courts claimed supreme authority in deciding whether a marriage was valid. Priests and bishops examined questions of kinship, consent, and consummation with relentless detail. A whispered vow in a field could, in their eyes, carry as much weight as one spoken at the altar, provided witnesses supported it. Yet this power was never free of controversy, for families often resisted rulings that threatened their wealth or honor. Secular courts, meanwhile, addressed the consequences of unions. Property rights, inheritance, and obligations of service often fell into their jurisdiction. When dowries went unpaid or promises were broken, it was before these judges that quarrels erupted. Villages saw neighbors dragged into disputes, where arguments over a single cow or field could decide the survival of families. Law, in this sense, was both shield and sword. The records of these courts remain among the clearest windows into medieval life. They reveal not only the disputes of the powerful, but the daily struggles of ordinary folk. A wife pleading for the return of her dowry, a husband contesting the legitimacy of his child, a family feuding over a promised union. All these voices still echo in the parchment of judgments. The law preserved what daily life often silenced. These cases show how deeply law and marriage were entwined. What the altar sanctified, the courts enforced or dissolved, weaving together divine will and human necessity. The Church claimed to guard souls, while secular rulers guarded lands, yet both met in the tangled knots of marriage disputes. No household was beyond their reach, for the union of man and woman touched every corner of society. At times, the authority of church and crown collided. Kings bristled when papal decrees annulled marriages that secured their power, and bishops struggled when local lords ignored canon rulings. This friction exposed the fragile balance between spiritual and temporal power. Behind every conflict lay families caught in the middle, their futures dictated by forces greater than themselves. For women, the law was both protection and prison. Courts could defend their right to a dowry or inheritance, yet the same law confirmed their subordination to husbands. Justice, when granted, often came at the cost of reputation, for women who stood before judges were easily branded disobedient or dishonorable. The shield of law was heavy, and its protection never free of judgment. When I consider these disputes now, I see law as the silent partner in every medieval marriage. It recorded, corrected, and condemned, ensuring that no union was merely private. Behind the blessings of priests and the smiles of families stood the stern gaze of judges, ready to inscribe their verdicts upon lives. Marriage was not only of the heart or the hearth, it was also of the ledger and the seal. In the villages where I once lingered, marriage was as much an economic act as a personal one. Two households merged not only their lives but their resources, pooling labor, animals, and land. A man without a wife struggled to keep his fields, and a woman without a husband faced isolation in her work. To wed was to weave survival, ensuring that no acre went untilled and no child went unfed. Among nobles, the economic stakes were far greater. Dowries transferred wealth across borders, and inheritances consolidated vast estates. Through marriage, castles passed into new hands, and alliances carried not only banners, but treasuries. Armies could be financed, fortresses maintained, and debts settled through the wealth brought by a single bride. What might appear as celebration was, at its core, a transaction shaping the fortunes of dynasties. In towns, marriage tied itself to the guilds and crafts that drove urban prosperity. Many guilds restricted membership to married men, believing that stability of household ensured honesty in trade. A craftsman's wife often managed accounts, oversaw apprentices, and sold goods in the market. Her labor, though rarely acknowledged, was essential to the household's economic survival. Marriage thus underpinned the growth of medieval commerce. For peasants, livestock often became part of marital arrangements. A cow, a flock of sheep, or a plough might accompany a bride into her new household, gifts that meant sustenance for years to come. These tokens were not symbolic, they were lifelines. I remember watching as families bartered and exchanged, knowing that the future of children depended upon what could be gathered before the wedding feast began. The burden of providing dowries weighed heavily on poorer families. Fathers sold plots of land, mothers spun and wove tirelessly, and siblings contributed their wages to secure a sister's marriage. The sacrifice was immense, but without it, the girl risked remaining unmarried, a fate that could spell hardship for all. Each union carried the invisible cost of years of saving and toil. Economic failure could unravel marriages as surely as betrayal. Debts, unpaid dowries, or disputes over inheritance often drove families into courts or into conflict with neighbors. Marriages meant to unite wealth sometimes left households poorer, embroiled in endless quarrels. In this way, the pursuit of prosperity through union revealed its darker side, sowing discord where harmony had been promised. Even festivals of marriage reflected economic realities. Feasts required slaughtering animals, brewing ale, and providing bread for entire communities. A family's generosity was measured at the table, their honor tied to the abundance they could afford. Yet behind the laughter and music lingered the weight of cost. For many began married life already in debt to kin or neighbors who had lent them aid. When I look back, I see that marriage was one of the strongest pillars of the medieval economy. It was through these unions that wealth shifted, labor was secured, and survival was ensured. The fields, guilds, and courts all bore witness to how deeply intertwined love, duty, and livelihood had become. Beneath every vow was the quiet truth. To marry was also to reckon with the coin, the plough, and the ledger. Every union in medieval Europe unfolded beneath the watchful gaze of the church. From the lowliest peasant to the loftiest noble, vows exchanged before an altar gave marriages legitimacy that no contract alone could secure. priests reminded couples that their bond mirrored the union of Christ and his church, binding them not only to each other, but also to heaven's will. To marry outside this blessing was to risk scandal and suspicion. The church gradually claimed full authority over marriage, declaring it a sacrament by the 12th century. This transformation elevated the act beyond a worldly contract into a holy covenant. With such weight came rules, prohibitions against close kinship, requirements of consent, and the need for public ceremonies. These laws reshaped European households, curbing certain traditions and reinforcing clerical influence over daily life. Yet not all unions rested easily with the church's ideals. Nobles, eager for alliances, sometimes arranged marriages that clashed with canon law, especially in cases of consanguinity. Dispensation had to be sought from Rome, making the Pope a powerful arbiter of dynastic futures. In these disputes, theology intertwined with politics, showing how spiritual decrees carried worldly consequences. Religious rituals colored every stage of marriage. The blessing of the rings, the sprinkling of holy water, and the solemn pronouncement of vows filled the ceremony with sacred gravity. Afterward, priests might bless the marriage bed, invoking fertility and harmony. Such rites gave reassurance to communities that the household was not only lawful, but sanctified by divine approval. Confession and penance also shaped married life. Husbands and wives were reminded of their duties through sermons that emphasized fidelity, moderation, and mutual respect. Adultery was not merely a personal failing, but a sin that endangered the soul. In villages, whispers of transgression could draw the eye of both priest and neighbor, making religious morality a constant companion to marital bonds. Pilgrimages sometimes offered couples a way to heal broken unions. Husbands and wives, estranged or burdened by guilt, walked together to holy shrines in search of forgiveness. The journey itself became a test of reconciliation, with each mile traveled in hope of restored trust. In this way, faith not only judged, but also offered redemption for those who strayed. Even festivals and holy days carried expectations for marriage. Weddings often coincided with religious feasts, intertwining sacred calendars with family milestones. To wed during Lent, for instance, was forbidden, as the season demanded solemnity rather than celebration. The Church thus controlled the rhythm of both faith and festivity, weaving its influence through the most personal decisions. Looking back, one cannot ignore how deeply religion permeated the fabric of medieval marriage. It gave structure, imposed rules, and promised eternal significance to an earthly union. Behind every vow spoken and every blessing bestowed was the conviction that God Himself presided, ensuring that the bond was not just a matter of flesh and estate, but a covenant written in the language of eternity. In medieval Europe, the question of whether a woman's voice mattered in marriage was both debated and contested. The Church insisted that valid unions required the consent of both bride and groom, a radical stance compared to earlier customs where family decisions often prevailed. Yet in practice, many young women were pressured into agreements they could not refuse. The balance between personal choice and familial duty was fragile, often bending under the weight of tradition and power. The bride's consent was frequently overshadowed by the authority of her father or guardian. Especially among noble families, marriages were sealed long before the girl reached maturity, her hand promised as part of larger negotiations. Canon law acknowledged the necessity of her yes, but in courts across Europe, proving coercion was difficult. Silence, a lowered gaze, or hesitation could easily be interpreted as compliance, turning ambiguity into assent. Still, not all women accepted such constraints passively. Records reveal instances of brides fleeing to monasteries or appealing to bishops to escape unwanted marriages. The cloister offered both sanctuary and autonomy, providing women a way to reject the future imposed on them. These acts of resistance, though rare, demonstrated that female agency did exist, even if it came at the cost of scandal and family rupture. Peasant women navigated consent differently from their noble counterparts. Without dynastic wealth at stake, their opinions often carried greater weight in choosing a husband. A shared field, livestock, or local reputation influenced unions more than papal decrees. While pressure still existed, rural brides could more easily refuse a match they deemed unsuitable, making their voices louder in smaller communities. Literature and court records also reveal women asserting themselves within marital disputes. Some boldly claimed marriages had been arranged without their approval, demanding annulments. Others cited pre-contract, an earlier promise to another man, as grounds to dissolve an unwanted union. These appeals, though difficult to win, show that women could harness legal channels to defend their right to choose. Romantic love sometimes empowered women in unexpected ways. A determined couple could elope, bypassing parental authority by swearing vows privately, then appealing to the church to validate their union. Although risky, this practice acknowledged that true consent lay with the couple, not the family. Such stories, whispered in villages and chronicled in courts, highlighted the tension between individual will and societal order. Religious teachings reinforced the idea that consent sanctified marriage. Priests warned men not to force unions, emphasizing that both souls must willingly bind before God. These reminders carried moral weight, even if they were not always respected. Women could, at least in theory, claim divine backing for their right to say yes or no, placing conscience above coercion. In the end, women's consent in medieval marriage was both recognized and undermined, protected in principle, yet often compromised in practice. Their agency flickered between silence and defiance, between submission and bold assertion. It was a fragile flame, but one that continued to burn, reminding us that even in an age of constraint, women found ways to carve out their will within the bonds of matrimony. Across medieval Europe, not all marriages endured the test of time or circumstance. Though divorce was forbidden by the church, annulments provided a narrow path to dissolve a union, declaring it invalid from the start. Grounds for annulment were varied, ranging from consanguinity, marrying a relative too closely related, to claims of coercion or pre-existing vows. These cases were complex, requiring evidence and persuasion before ecclesiastical courts. One of the most common reasons was the discovery of kinship within prohibited degrees. The church expanded these degrees so widely that many couples could be accused of illegitimacy without special dispensation. This gave clerics immense influence, as noble families sometimes sought annulments on these grounds when political alliances shifted. A union once advantageous could suddenly be branded unlawful, dissolving bonds with legal and moral authority. Impotence or inability to consummate also served as grounds for annulment. Though humiliating, accusations of physical incapacity were sometimes pursued in desperate attempts to escape unwanted unions. Medical examinations or testimonies might be called upon, placing intimate details before clerical judges. These proceedings blurred the private with the public, exposing personal struggles in the name of justice and release. Pre-contract provided another escape route. If it could be proven that a spouse had promised marriage to another beforehand, the later union was deemed invalid. This loophole reflected the seriousness with which vows were regarded, even spoken informally. Many annulment cases hinged on such claims, sparking disputes between families and lovers alike, each side eager to defend honor or gain freedom. Annulments were rarely straightforward, often entangled with wealth and influence. A poor peasant had little chance of success, while the nobility could leverage status to bend church law in their favor. Papal dispensations or annulments could even be purchased in Rome, making the outcome less about morality and more about connections and coin. The church's role as arbiter was both spiritual and deeply political. Women sometimes found refuge in annulments when coerced into unions against their will. By testifying to force or invoking lack of true consent, they could appeal for freedom. Though the odds were slim, the church occasionally upheld these claims, acknowledging the sacred necessity of willing vows. Such victories were rare, but they carved moments of autonomy within an otherwise rigid framework. The social consequences of annulment were significant. Families could suffer shame, alliances could collapse, and reputations might never recover. Yet for some, the chance to sever bonds outweighed these risks. The process could redefine not only the lives of individuals, but the fortunes of entire lineages, reshaping inheritance and shifting power. Though limited, annulments reveal that medieval marriage was not as unbreakable as it first appeared. Beneath the weight of doctrine and tradition, loopholes allowed cracks to form. Within those cracks, individuals, sometimes desperate, sometimes cunning, found ways to challenge, undo, and rewrite the vows that once bound them. The institution of marriage in the Middle Ages was never static. It was a living system shaped by power, faith, survival, and human desire. What began as practical arrangements for land, alliances, and survival evolved into a framework deeply entwined with the Church's authority. Marriage became both a sacred vow and a legal contract, binding hearts and property alike. In this dual role, it defined the rhythm of medieval life across every social class. For nobles, unions were weapons of diplomacy. Castles, titles, and entire kingdoms could hinge upon a single ceremony, turning weddings into events of grand spectacle and immense consequence. For peasants, however, marriage was simpler, yet equally vital, offering stability in a world of toil and uncertainty. From lavish cathedrals to humble village chapels, vows carried weight that reached beyond two individuals. The Church's firm grip ensured that marriage became more than personal. It was a cornerstone of Christian morality and communal order. By sanctifying unions, priests reinforced values of fidelity, obedience, and family life as reflections of divine will. Yet this same authority also created tension, as personal freedom often clashed with rigid expectations. The Church's dominance guaranteed stability, but rarely without conflict. Love, though not always the centerpiece, gradually began to seep into the conversation. Troubadours sang of passion, poets of courtly devotion, and stories of forbidden romance flourished in medieval literature. While most marriages were practical, these cultural expressions revealed a longing for deeper bonds. They whispered of hearts resisting duty, suggesting that affection could matter even when politics ruled. Women navigated this world with resilience and strategy. Bound by obedience yet crucial to alliances, they found ways to exercise influence through dowries, lineage, and motherhood. Their role within marriage highlighted both constraint and agency, a paradox that defined much of medieval womanhood. Through them, family legacies endured, and dynasties rose or fell. Children carried the consequences of these unions, their futures mapped out by decisions made long before their birth. Inheritance laws, legitimacy, and arranged matches meant their lives were often predetermined. Yet within these structures, new possibilities could emerge. Some children broke free from their paths, becoming monks, nuns, scholars, or rebels against tradition. Despite its flaws, the medieval marriage system left a lasting imprint on European culture. It laid foundations for modern ideas of family, inheritance, and even romantic expectation. What began in necessity evolved into a blend of faith, law, and love, echoing through the centuries. Its shadow stretches into the present, where echoes of those vows still shape our understanding of partnership. The story of medieval marriage is one of both oppression and resilience, rigidity and adaptation. It reveals how people sought connection within the limits of their time, striving to balance survival with longing, faith with desire. In those vows whispered before God and witness, humanity's eternal search for meaning in union can still be heard.